Hello and Assalamu alaikum. I'm Parvez Khan. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Puhat University of Science and Technology. The subject is intercultural communication. The course code is JMC 201. It's our lecture number 10. The topic is four stages of culture shock and adjusting in a different culture. So we'll be talking about what is a culture shock, how are we going to be getting ourselves adjusted in a different environment. So before going into that, we'll talk about the objectives. What will the students gain after attending this session? So they'll be able to understand the different stages of culture shock. They will have a better understanding of how different stages affect us. And in addition to that, it will give them a comprehensive understanding of to them to help survive in an environment which is other than their own, which is different, where they've never been before. So this is the core objective of the session. Previously, in our previous session, we discussed the culture effect from psychological perspective and different perspectives. We went into in-depth definitions, but we're just going to talk a bit about it again. That when you experience something new in a different culture, it can cause a shock that can be called a culture shock, or which is when you're trying to when you're having feeling of isolation in a new place, that can lead towards a culture shock which is different from yours. And it can also be disorientation caused after being exposed to or living in a new place. This disorientation, in fact, can also lead to a culture shock. Uh, it's different. It can also happen from when you're going from your own culture, family, and traditions, and when we experience something completely new or different, that can lead towards a culture shock. So it's not just that you get shocked or you're just getting feelings of disorientation or anxiety all the time. It can also be something new that you've never experienced before, something which is different from your own culture, own settings. And when you experience that, that can be surprising. It can also be overwhelming. That can also be a culture shock. So there are different stages of culture shock. Even in this diagram, you can see that there are different phases, and each individual, when he goes from their own environment to a next environment, which they have not been exposed to previously before, that can lead towards a culture shock. It's a different feeling. It mostly happens when you go out from your own comfort zone, from your own settings to a different place. So let's talk about the four stages. What are the four stages of culture shock? Obviously, there are four different stages. The first stage is called the honeymoon stage, or the excitement stage, or the excitement period. It can also be followed by the frustration stage, and then there's adjustment stage, and finally we'll talk about the acceptance stage. But there are different stages. For example, if you're going to a completely new place, the first few bits can be very exciting, and it's called the honeymoon stage. It's called the excitement stage. It's just something that you go there. It's excitement of a new place. For example, if you're going out to a new country, for example, if you're going out to Britain, we've heard some people say that when they landed, they were excited about how beautiful the monuments were, how beautiful the historical buildings were. They were surprised by the underground trains and the cultures and the different things. That leads to excitement. It's pretty exciting in the beginning, and it's lovely to walk around to see different places, and it's beautiful weather and things like that. That can add. It can be intense. It can be satisfying. There can be a lot of joy in what you're experiencing, and especially when there's a lot of talk about cultural experiences, the different languages, people from all around the world, and the food and the friends you make initially. It's pretty much exciting as well, and it gives you much more like what you can say that like a tourist experience, because when tourists go to a place, they have cameras with them, they're taking pictures of each and everything. There's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of joy in attending social events, even dramas or cinemas or the cultures or the people. They give a lot of satisfying experience, and it's pretty much enjoyable. But as you know that as the time progresses, it's not the only thing that's happening, and eventually it fades, because life is not just going to go like that, like a tourist for the rest of the year. There comes a time when students, when they go out, they have to start with studies, or someone, if they go out for work experience, obviously they have to begin working. And that's the point when things start to change, because after the small good period, the period of excitement, the time period which is very much satisfying, and where there's a lot of fun, eventually things start to fade. And that's the point when you go to the next point that we're going, next stage that we're going to talk about. That is where you feel lost, confused, unclear, perplexed, disoriented, and that is the frustration stage. That's where frustration begins, and it's pretty complicated, because you feel difficulty in understanding new circumstances. You're not familiar with how the work culture is, education culture is, how the institutions work. That causes a bit of frustration to people, especially when they go out from a very different culture to a new place where they have not been told much about it, where they haven't heard much about it. That can lead to a bit of frustration. And especially when you have some language issues, you don't understand the slang languages, or when you don't understand how they say thank you. For example, if you go to England or Scotland, they may say ta, which can be like thank you, and you may not know like what they said. For example, in some cultures, it may not sound appropriate to shake hands, and you can just wave your hands or make a gesture. That's something different. So that can lead towards a bit of frustration because you are not exposed to it, you're not used to it, you don't know much about it, and that can be a little bit problematic. And especially there can be homesickness and feeling of returning back to family. It happens a lot, especially for people who have had long extended families back home. They're connected, their parties, their eat parties, or their gatherings, and suddenly you go out there and there's hardly anyone you can go out and meet, like your relatives or friends, and it's a new setup. You don't have much friends, you don't know how to socialize, you don't know the socialization channels where you can go out and take your mind off these things. So initially it gets a bit difficult, especially for the young students when they go out there in a very young age. It can be problematic, it can be frustrating at the end. Some of them, and this is a very critical point, because most of the people that we often hear that he went to England or USA or China and they suddenly came back, they obviously come back after the second stage. And this happens a lot because suddenly the frustration level is so high, all that you want to do is just escape it, just run away from it, and it can just lead you to make some rash decisions of coming back and going out. And yes, things are different because when you're out there, you're on your own, you have to wash your own dishes, you have to work out differently, you have to be very punctual to different places, and especially when it's in academia or in the workplace. That's a completely different setup, especially when you're going from a high context culture to a low context culture, and you don't care much about time. That can lead towards frustration, because here we often hear people saying that I'll be coming in 1 hour, and then we keep looking at the clock all the time, and they don't appear until it's 2 or 3 hours late, and that's because it's part of culture. And when you go out there, it's different. People have very limited time. They will give you time on the email. You have to be very specific, especially when you're dealing with a foreign professor. If he gives you time, it's more like money if he's giving you. And you have to value that. If you don't, if you miss out, if you're late, it's like an insult. So these are the things that can lead to pressures, but this is how their culture is, and this is what needs an understanding. And in addition to that, frustration leads to strong emotions and mood changes. Obviously, it affects you how you think, and it forces you to take decisions. And obviously, you focus more on the differences than similarities. Because initially, when you were in honeymoon period or the excitement stage was there, you were focusing more on similarities. People of this place are not different from us. They're eating like us. They have families. They enjoy their lives. But as soon as time progresses and you are into the frustration stage, you think more about the differences, that, oh, we're different. This is not right. This is wrong. And the negativity overwhelms you. It forces you to make some rash decisions. It can be problematic, but this is how it happens. It doesn't necessarily work in this way that all of us have to go through the same honeymoon stage and then the frustration stage. It can be different. It can be in bits and pieces. You can have a very good initial few months and then frustration can begin. But it comes eventually at some point, because you are in a different setup. You are different. You spend your entire life in a different place and different culture with different customs and traditions, and suddenly you go to a different place. So yes, it changes. It affects you. So this is the frustration, but that's not the end. We are followed by a very good period, a very good time, that if you stay there, an adjustment eventually takes place, that you start being comfortable in new surroundings, you're comfortable in walking around, you feel yourself not misplaced, and that is called an adjustment state, where you believe that yes, you can be adjusted in the settings. And what happens that there's a lot of familiarity with the new environment. You feel it's familiar, it's not different. It's like a place known to you because you spend more time. It gets more familiar. So this is what leads towards adjustment and lesser anxiety. And this is a step. It's a cycle that obviously you realize that you're here for a purpose. If it's a work, if you've been there for work, that's a purpose. If you're there for education, that's if you're gone for immigration or whatever purpose. Adjustment is something that everyone wants because that's how you'll be able to survive. If you're not getting adjusted, it's going to be difficult and you will be back in the second stage. So that's important. And the last one is obviously the acceptance stage. You accept the differences, you know who you are in relation to others, you know what your customs are in relation to others. There's a lot of difference, but still you start the amount of respect for them, you start being confident about who you are. And that's the point. You cannot completely change yourself where you've been to. You cannot leave behind what your part of schemata is, what you have been fed all of your life. It's hard to change. It's good to accept new things in a new culture. But most what defines you are what in the environment you grew up in, the circumstances, the culture, the tradition, the schemata, it all affects you. But when you accept that yes, who you are, what your true identity is, it's easier to survive because you accept who you are in relation to others. You value their beliefs, you value that culture, but with respect to your own. And that's what this gets easier because you start, it begins to seem pretty much normal. It's like living with a difference is a new normal. You know what they're different from you, but that's the new normal. You believe in it. You find very happy. You are very happy about it. Like it's just getting pretty much normal. When things get normal, adjustment gets easier. That's the point. You accept it. But as long as you're not accepting it, it becomes difficult. It's become tougher. So these were the 4 stages that we discussed, and now I would like to play a very short video that explains the phenomena, the 4 stages of culture shock. And I think this video it's less than it's almost a 1-minute video, which will give you a clear perspective of what we have discussed so far. So let's enjoy this short video for a while. Yes, the second stage is the irritation or the frustration as we call it. The third one is adjustment. You start adjusting, or here they say the recovery stage. And obviously the 4th stage is the integration, the acceptance that we've talked about. So yes, these are the 4 stages. The first one is the excitement stage, and the honeymoon stage that you're pretty much excited about, how things are, the new cultures are, it pretty much attracts you. The second one is obviously when the frustration kicks in, you begin worrying, you focus more on the differences. And then later on, when you spend more time, you begin to adjust, and finally you integrate yourself. That is called acceptance stage. So these are the 4 stages that we've discussed. And finally, we'll be coming towards the adjustment tips, how we can adjust ourselves better in a different environment. And obviously, language is one of the most important skills, because if you're familiar with language, with the signs and symbols and the cultural traditions in context to language, I think it helps you a lot, because language is one of the key elements to help you survive better in a different environment. So the better language you understand, no matter which language it is, whether it's English, Chinese, Japanese, if you're good at it, if you get better at it, it will help you survive it better, it will help you adjust better, it will give you an edge. Because what we see is mostly when Pakistanis go out, they remain attached to their own communities. And that at times can be problematic, because when you're living with your own community, when you're just looking after that I should only meet Pakistanis and I should only live with them, that can also turn out problematic. It can be helpful initially when they help you get set up, they show you things. But what happens is that you stop learning much more about their language, you stop learning about different cultures, you interact with people, with them quite less, So it's good if you go out there to a different culture, you must interact with the locals, you must interact and speak with the people so that it can give you an edge. And obviously, participation in social activities is as important as language. So if you see a good university event or a cultural event or a social activity, participation helps you give a better perspective of how things work here. For example, if you're in Thailand and people are throwing water, it's one of the ceremonies where they enjoy and they throw water on each other. That was pretty exciting for me because I've never seen people throwing water. But when you participate, when you know it, it's a kind of a celebration. It can become enjoyable. And apart from that, as I just said, interact with people. The more you interact, the more you talk, the better understanding you will have, the better in-depth view you will have about the people, the better world view of them, how they live, how they survive, and what this culture is all about. It will give you an edge because the more you interact, the better you will get at it. Interaction is the key. If you don't interact, you won't be able to understand how this culture works, how the system works, or how I can get around and walk around in their shoes comfortably. And obviously, exposure to arts, literature, and cultural productions are as necessary, and it can help even before going. For example, if you're reading a lot, if you're reading literature, if you're watching cinema, if you're watching films or documentaries before going, or whatever your plans are, it can give you a little bit of understanding how it works. Nowadays, we have bombardments of information on social media sites, YouTubes, and different. We can get an understanding of how the people of the place live and enjoy their lives and what the beliefs are by simply watching some documentaries. It may not give a complete picture because obviously living experience is something different. But if you get the basic perspective, that can also help a lot in adjustment because you know what the basic beliefs are, you know what their food is, what their culture is, what they likes and dislikes, and these kinds of things can help. And similarly, cinema, especially the art films, they give you a very, very close perspective because the more art films you watch, you know that the world is not much different from yours, especially if you're watching a Spanish film or French movie or anything. It gives you an in-depth analysis of French culture. It may not happen a lot in the mainstream Hollywood or Bollywood films because they are mostly commercial oriented, even though it shows you how commercial the world is getting. But even then, an art film can give you a very in-depth picture of how a particular culture is, especially if you're looking for Irani culture, French culture. Their cinema is a very good reflection. They've made films with low budgets, but that gives very good explanation of their culture. And we've already discussed some of the films. We've talked about some Buddhist culture in some of the films, and we've also discussed about the different cultures. We've also talked about some films that you've seen. Some of the students told me they saw films like 7 Years in Tibet, The Kundan. This also gives you a perspective of how, and a very different culture from us, how they live, how they survive, how they work on. Similarly, documentaries like Samsara, it gives a very, very wide perspective of how people from around the world are living in some very, very unique places. So yes, arts, literature, cultural productions, they can help you understand what's going around you. So these are some of the tips, and obviously these tips will help you understand. And if you are in a place other than yours, the best thing is to give time because time heals everything. Time gives a better perspective, and times will give you, and the changing times will give you further confidence. So it's all about spending more time. It's not just that you enjoy a certain period, you get frustrated, you come back. That's not the right way to approach it. You have to wait, you have to get adjusted, you have to accept the differences. And that's where you progress in a culture different from yours. And that's how you deal with the culture shocks. And obviously, these tips are not just helpful for cultural shocks, it's also helpful in multicultural environment. For example, if you're going from a village to a very rich urban city, these tips will also help you understand that you have to make new friends, you'll have to make new social interactions, you have to go out for socializations, you have to see for new avenues that can help you understand, give a better perspective of city. But if you are just confining yourself inside your home and you believe that you cannot interact with the outside world, obviously it will lead to further complications. So yes, before we end, the last point once again to talk about was that one of the tips that we can talk about is also staying connected with friends and families through internet. Obviously, these days, social media has changed a lot. Everyone is connected through Skype, WhatsApp. So the more we talk with our friends back home or people, it also helps reduce homesickness a bit. When you know that you're talking to someone on webcam, they can see you, they can talk to you. You feel as if you are seeing them every day, and it helps reduces homesickness to a certain bit. So yes, these are some of the adjustment tips. And before we conclude our session once again or re-summarize, I'll basically go for some questions that I'm interested, like what do our students think about these 4 stages? Do you think it helped them give a better perspective if they go out? Will it help them? And secondly, what do you know about the Western or Eastern culture, especially what you have been exposed to? Obviously, you have read some books, you have seen some films. So, what do you think about these cultures? What is it in your mind? For example, what you have seen, and it helps a lot because if you're seeing only films where there's violence and only mugging, and it's a dangerous, dangerous world. Because, for example, all the crimes that are taking place in New York may give a very different picture of New York when you actually go there. That can be very different. So it's important to think in those terms, and obviously, which documentaries or films that you have seen about other cultures that may have helped you give a perspective. And in addition to that, is it important to respect others' culture? Because what you see in films may be quite different from what reality, especially the mainstream commercial films, can give you a complete different picture from reality. But is it important to respect other cultures when you go out there? Because if you respect them, do you think they'll respect you in return? And is it important to have such experiences? Is it important to travel? Is it important to read? So I think these are the questions that you need to ask yourself as a student, that how it's going to help you make a better, get a better perspective of culture shock or culture. If you're exposed to a different culture, how you would react to it and how it will help you. This and how this discussion, especially about films, readings, how it's going to help you get better insights even before going there. So yes, these are some of the interesting questions that I'll be looking forward to talking to you about it. And obviously, the process of adjustment, just like you're leaving home, you this is one example that a person leaves home, he arrives in Australia, he gets a culture shock, and then he's adjusting himself. And as you see, the curve is going up, his completion of studies, and then he leaves back Australia and comes back. Remember, there's a term called reverse culture shock as well, because now, since you were exposed to different culture, you lived there. When you come back, you may even get reverse culture shock. You may find things odd. You may find things, the way people speak angrily, very odd, the language, the tone, the way institutions work. That can cause a little bit of reverse shock. But it's an interesting topic. We'll keep talking about it in our next lectures as well. These are some of the references that we've used. Very interesting discussion we've had. I hope you enjoyed this session. But before ending our session, I'd like to once again talk about the 4 stages, so that it's clear crystal that, for example, if you are going out from a culture other than yours, when you go out there, you may have a very good excitement period initially. You may enjoy the time. It may be very exciting initially, but then it is followed by the second stage called as frustration stage. It may lead to frustration, anxiety, depression. But obviously, the more time you spend, it will lead to an adjustment phase where you begin to feel comfortable, when you know you have a feeling inside that I can adjust. And finally, when you're there, it's all comfortable, it's all easy, and that's the acceptance stage. You accept who you are in relation to others. So this was one of our session. It was a pretty engaging one. I hope there's a lot to talk and a lot to think. I would like you to think on some of the questions I put forward, and we'll be talking and recommending some of the films and documentaries in our journalism page. So I hope that we stay in touch. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much once again.